Thank you. I didn't realize I was going first, so now it's really incumbent on me to keep the time limits that we've been given. I'll do my best. I'd like to start with talking for a few minutes about an author that I often introduce in my international relations classes at the graduate and undergraduate level, a man by the name of Thucydides, who was an Athenian general who was exiled during a long war between the Athenians and the Spartans in the 5th century. BC, and who, as a result of his exile, wrote a history of the war between those two cities and their allies. He claimed in that history that what he was talking about was the greatest commotion or movement, or the Greek word kinesis, ever in human history, and that the analysis he was going to offer would be a gift to humankind, quote, for all time. Because he suggested from the analysis, the history that he wrote, we would learn a lot about human nature and about the way human beings are likely to behave under similar circumstances anywhere, in any culture, at any time. And certain groups of social scientists continue to refer to Thucydides and his analysis even in contemporary textbooks. So this is not just some obscure reference from way out there. And those of you who grew up in an era when we still read the classics as part of our secondary education probably all recognize the name. One of the many interesting aspects of Thucydides' writing is his treatment of religious belief. It's sometimes useful, I think, and this is why I do this with students, to step back to an earlier time because it gives us some distance from our current concerns, which helps us to better see the lines of argument and the force of the analytical categories that we are using. And so I'd like to say a few words about that and then move to a second part of what I want to talk about, which is modern secularization theories. The gods and religious belief are not a part of Thucydides' analysis. He makes that clear near the beginning of his book when he says, I'm not going to write interesting poetic accounts of history. And he's referring there obliquely and sometimes directly to his predecessors, Homer and Herodotus, who both wrote histories. Homer, of course, you all know his great epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And Herodotus wrote a long history of the Persian Wars, which occurred about 80 years before the time that Thucydides is writing. Thucydides says he wants to talk about human behavior under specific circumstances, and he makes it clear that religion and religious belief may inform that behavior, but that is a separate question from whether or not there are gods. It is a separate question from what the nature of those gods might be and what the relationship to human beings might be. And Thucydides implies he hasn't got any competence in that area. He is neither a prophet nor an oracle, so he's not going to talk about religion in that regard. Now, on the other hand, he does want to concern himself at times with whether religious belief actually has any impact on human behavior, regardless of its truth or falsehood, regardless of whether there are gods or not. And he indicates in several of the episodes he recounts that impiety, for example, inattention to the gods, has bad consequences. There is, near the beginning of the war between Athens and Sparta, a plague at Athens, which again he refers to as a kinesis, in the sense that there was a domestic breakdown as a result of this public health catastrophe. And Thucydides observes that that breakdown includes that people lose their piety. They stop praying to the gods, he says, because they discover it makes no difference whether you do or not. And he seems to indicate that this is not necessarily a good idea because that has further effects on good public order. There is a revolution which takes place at one of the small city-states that is allied with the Spartans. And he shows there, again, that there's a domestic breakdown as a result of the class warfare that is part of this revolution between the oligarchs, or the aristocrats, and the many, the demos, the crowds, on the other hand. And he also, in that place, includes an observation that, in fact, people lost their piety, paid no attention anymore to the gods, nor to the laws which the gods had given to humankind, or at least they believed had been given to them by the gods, and they ignore the moral dictates of religion. And he shows again how this is a feature of the breakdown of social order, and he leaves us to make our own conclusions, but suggests that this is not a good thing. He also points out in another place that we can use religious doctrine as an excuse for what we want to do. There's a very famous episode that all students of international relations still read, known as the Melian Dialogue, where the Athenians sail over to the island of Melos and tell the people there that, you know, we're big, you're small, you need to give up, you need to become part of our empire, even though you have been neutral for a certain period of time, etc., etc. And here's part of the speech from the Athenians. You know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And this is a very famous phrase translated variously. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. The Malians respond with some discussion about the gods and how the gods might feel about this, and this is the Athenian reply to that. When you speak of the favor of the gods, we may as fairly hope for that as yourselves. Neither our pretensions nor our conduct being in any way contrary to what men believe of the gods or practice among themselves. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature they rule wherever they can. In other words, the gods, just like human beings, do what they can if they're strong and suffer what they must if they are weak. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same as we do. Thus, as far as the gods are concerned, we have no fear and no reason to believe that we shall be at a disadvantage. So sometimes we invoke religion, Thucydides points out, as a way of essentially doing as we wish to anyway. And in this case, the Athenians make this wonderful cosmological argument, quite in violation, I might point out, of most of what they had earlier said about their beliefs concerning the gods, that we are behaving just as the gods do, which is that if we can, we will, kick your tushes and take your names, and if we can't, we will suffer what we must. And this is what the gods do, and this is what we do. In other cases, we actually notice Thucydides showing us that religious doctrine can serve as a constraint on our actions. The Corinthians, at the beginning of the war, try to persuade the Spartans to begin a war, and the Athenians try to persuade them not to. And it's pretty clear the Spartans are reluctant to do so, are reluctant to begin a war with the Athenians, unless they can be persuaded that the gods would approve, as attested in Greek law, which comes from the gods, or as attested by an oracle who speaks for the gods. And both sides play on the fact that of that piety and on the questions of whether the gods would allow this or not in the speeches they deliver concerning, whether it's time for war or whether we can still somehow constrain ourselves here and make peace. And so Thucydides does not give us a theology. He does not give us an account of the gods the way that Homer or Hesiod or Herodotus did, but he is interested simply in seeing how religious belief and religious doctrine play into the question of human behavior. And he suggests, as evolutionary psychologists do 2,500 years later, that we are in fact moral beings. And one of the things that often happens when we read Thucydides, of course, is we want to immediately skip from these descriptions and these accounts of human behavior, of what happened, right, to a prescription of what should happen. Now, social scientists, of which I am one, by and large want to avoid that move. Some do so out of doctrinal or ideological commitments that I'll talk about for just a couple of minutes. Doctrinal, ideological commitments to value neutrality, which I think, for reasons I can't go into here, is a highly questionable move. I'm not sure there is such a thing as value neutrality. And others do so more in the line of Thucydides, that they want to be impartial. And they are interested in the human thing, the human phenomena, and they make no claim to be able to talk about the divine or make theological kinds of arguments. And so what we are interested in as social scientists is human behavior, human action, human judgment, human activities in various realms. And we want to maybe ask how religious belief interacts with that, can either itself be affected by or brought into being by other aspects of human existence, or on the other hand, how religious belief affects other aspects of human existence. So both are fair game for a social scientist. What happens to religious belief under certain circumstances? How does religious belief affect human behavior under certain circumstances? But since we are not theologians, by and large, we as social scientists want to stay away from prescriptions about religious doctrines and practices, ethical codes and that kind of thing, unless we are doing it in sort of that social mode. And that, I want to remind you, is not the same thing as pointing out the relationship between such practices and how human beings act and behave under certain religious constraints or beliefs, or how certain religious beliefs might in fact be affected by social conditions and social phenomena. The second thing I want to talk about really briefly, and then I'll sit down and leave it to my colleagues, is the phenomenon of secularism. And this comes up a lot in current theological debate. And I just want to make a couple of comments about how secularism as a way of talking about the world, and in fact secularism as a prediction and a project of the Enlightenment and of modern social science, sometimes plays into our perception of what's going on in the world. Rodney Stark is a very well-known sociologist who argues that the first articulation of something like a theory or doctrine of secularization occurs in the 17th century, so a long time ago, by our reckoning, by Thomas Woolston, who appears to have been the first writer who set a date by which time, quote, modernity would have triumphed over faith. Now, the secularization argument, I should have said really secularization, not secularism. The secularization argument, hypothesis, doctrine, assumption, whatever you want to call it, contains several claims about religion and its fate in modern societies that I want to go through very quickly. The first is differentiation. The secularization hypothesis expects that religion will become a specialized institution in society with its own sphere of competence that differentiates or distinguishes it from other spheres of activity in society. Second, there is a logic of privatization that arises out of this differentiation, so that religion evolves into, quote, a matter of personal judgment and choice that exerts its impact on individuals, but that such a privatized faith is reluctant to tell society how it ought to behave. Third, there is the aspect to this of desacralization. Secularization as a hypothesis, theory, thesis, speculation, whatever you want to call it, includes not merely changes in religious organizations or institutions, or changes in the way that such entities relate to other organizations and institutions, but also changes in thought, in the very way we think about these things. And the argument there is that desacralization is a tendency to explain the everyday world in terms of material reality rather than supernatural forces, and that this will increasingly become the case not only among scientists or social scientists, but among the public in general. And fourth, the final aspect of secularization includes a kind of liberalization, which is to say that barriers between religious groups will diminish, and questions of orthodoxy will be relaxed, so that we're not going to get all hyper about these kinds of religious questions anymore. Now, what social scientists argued for the last 100 years or so is that, as a matter of fact, secularization is something that was probably going to happen, so it wasn't just a theory, it was a prediction. And secondly, it became a central way of thinking about social phenomena, and it became kind of a central theory and argument amongst social scientists. I don't have time to go into all the details, but the fact of the matter is that the current evidence indicates, and Rodney Stark is one of the ones who has made this argument, that secularization is a false theory, that in fact secularization has not happened. And so the question in the social sciences, and I'm going to have to simply leave you with this question rather than going into the details, the question in the social sciences is what next? If it is in fact the case that these four aspects I've talked about have not happened the way that they were predicted to have happened, and that in fact people have not diminished neither locally nor globally in the intensity of their religious belief, nor has the extent to which religious belief is thought to have connections to the rest of what we do, if that hasn't diminished, then where do social scientists go from here? And the big point that several contemporary social scientists make about this is that secularization as a way of seeing the world was in fact a filter through which we interpreted many phenomena that we saw around us, and that filter kept us from seeing certain things that we should have seen, and that as a matter of fact it disabled us. It was sort of a pattern of disability that affected our work in some very negative ways, because we expected certain developments over time that simply did not take place. And if I had an hour, I'd give you all the evidence for that, but I'll leave you with that to think about, that as a matter of fact, the connection or the disconnection between religious belief, religious doctrine, religious practice, and social practices has not developed in the way that social scientists believed it would, or anticipated it would, and that has had some rather negative effects on the way that we do our work. On the positive side, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention and go back to Thucydides and ask ourselves, how do we look at these phenomena in a dispassionate, somewhat, not objective at least, but in a somewhat away from sort of view, and how do we do our work in view of the fact that we certainly want to be impartial, even if we cannot be objective, and we certainly want to be impartial, even if secularization hasn't worked out for us the way that we thought it might. And I'll stop there.